Quite a few Chinese or East Asian junks have ventured to the United States or Europe over the years. These boats have been seen as somewhat distant and exotic, curiosities from another and very different world. But in fact, America had its own junk tradition. By the turn of the 20th century, junks and sampans had been plying the waters in and around California for decades, numbering in the dozens, hundreds perhaps. Even famous novelists like Jack London wrote about them. As one newspaper article said, the greater part of this oriental fleet in Occidental waters is employed in the shrimp fishing industry. Although apparently a relic of past ages, this craft is not to be despised as a useful boat for bay purposes. It is a very fast sailor capable of resisting squally weather and is easily handled. Its sail is typically Chinese, a huge square thing, perhaps 25 feet by 30 feet. A junk is built on the beach by Chinese shipbuilders. A new one was constructed at Hunter's Point. It took 3 months to put it together. In fact, from Mexico to San Diego and the Californian Channel Islands to Monterrey and San Francisco Bay, large groups of Chinese fishers gathered to exploit the great abundance of marine resources. Fish and marine mammals and even kelp were harvested in Chinese junks built by Chinese shipbuilders on American beaches and seashores. This map shows how the fishing camps and fishing grounds were dotted around San Francisco Bay. But while the Chinese might command the shrimp fishery, they dare not infringe on the fishing for other species. These were in the grip of fishermen from the Mediterranean countries and Portugal, these too having built beautiful replicas of the fishing craft that were familiar to them in their countries of origin. In San Francisco Bay, a Norwegian captain in a ship of North European design might pass by a Chinese crew with its sail from the ancient East, or a Genoese craft with a sail that would not have been unfamiliar in Egypt. Of course, junks were built to serve a purpose. In the shrimping industry, that meant servicing a set of nets in shallow waters within a few miles of the shore. They were of up to 50 feet or so, with a single mast and sail, and were quite flat-bottomed. The rudders were big, with the traditionally Chinese fenestration, that is, lozenge-shaped holes in the rudder. These rudders could be raised and lowered to suit the depth of water. They also had dagger boards that would be lowered in deeper waters, which, together with the big rudders, would provide the place of a keel in keeping the boat tracking through the water, rather than being blown sideways by the wind. But these could be raised when they reached the shallow water over the mud banks. When the wind failed, they had oars at the front of the vessel and a long sculling oar, a hewlow, at the stern. A very small number of larger two-masted junks also worked the bay, usually ferrying goods and people from the camps to other parts of the bay area. This from one of the newspapers of the day. The spectacle of a trading schooner, manned by a Chinese crew bearing a Chinese name, rigged after the Chinese fashion and hailing from San Francisco, has for some time past been quite familiar to the habitues of the waterfront. The schooner Ho King has a registered tonnage of 24 tons. What flag she would fly if occasion required, it is hard to say. The stars and stripes flying from the peak of such a craft, manned with such a crew, would be one of the strangest sights. The Daily Record Union need not have worried too much. In fact, Chinese-owned boats in the US were treated as alien vessels, not entitled to fly the flag. In the south of the state, the twin markets for abalone, meat for China and shells for the European jewellery industry, created a more than viable industry for Chinese fisherfolk, at the same time as nighttime squid fishing was supporting many Chinese fishers in and around Monterrey. The Southern California junks were required to do much longer journeys, sometimes hundreds of miles down into Mexico, where all the sailing was in the more open waters of the Pacific. These vessels were somewhat bigger than in the Bay Area, and they carried two masts in schooner arrangement rather than a single mast. There are even some hints that American captains were opting for Chinese junk rigs. Headline: The fishing junk has a hard time down south. The American junk Chromo, Captain William Gerald, returned today from a fishing cruise of 42 days down the lower Californian coast. Life in these Chinese-American fisheries was far from easy. Conditions were difficult, accidents and wrecks happened. There were tensions within the Chinese community and between ethnic groups, and the mood in the United States was extremely anti-Chinese. It would have taken many years of savings for a homesick Chinese to think about travelling home. So there is something terribly poignant about this newspaper item. Headline: They will never come back. 5 Chinese started on an adventurous sea voyage today, and it is extremely doubtful if they will ever be heard of again. They wished to go back to China, but were too poor to patronize the steamship companies. They owned a Chinese fishing junk with a single sail, and they started for China today in their frail craft. Their only navigating instrument is a 75-cent compass. Difficult working conditions, pogroms, anti-Chinese taxes, immigration rules targeted specifically at the Chinese. These all combined with tightening fish conservation rules that were also targeted directly at the Chinese fishers' fishing practices. Sometimes brutal, sometimes corrupt or inept, the fish patrol, made famous by Jack London, were constant obstacles. Even paying them off did not always protect against prosecution. Over time, stocks were depleted, immigration laws bit deep, mysterious fires destroyed camps, and the economics of fishing in California changed. Although some junk building continued into the first decades of the 20th century, the junks quietly disappeared from US waters, except for occasional exotic visitors. With the junks went the fishing camps in many cases. But when Hollywood went looking for a location for a John Wayne film, full of stereotypes, they turned to one of the remaining old Chinese villages, China Camp in Marin County, California.
Time, the present. Place, China. The village of Chikushan on the East China Sea. 180 people live here.
On Blood Alley. Hong Kong.
This camp remains today in the China Camp State Park, despite various threats over the years, including losing its last remaining resident, Frank Kwan, to old age only in the last decade. And with the camp, part of the time, is a vessel named after Frank's mother, Grace Kwan. The Grace Kwan is a precise replica of the old fishing junks. Ranger, shipwright, archaeologist, historian John Muir carried out extensive archaeological research, studied boat building methods in China, developed a plan for a replica, and led a team using traditional methods to build the Grace Kwan. Built from redwood, as were the Chinese-American junks, because of its availability rather than its natural suitability for marine use, its cotton sails are tanned with bark as they used to be. Hand-forged nails were used to hold planks one to the other. The single-masted boat carries the raisable rudder and dagger-style centerboard of the old boats, and the rigging lines would be very familiar to any 19th century Chinese junk sailor, or even a modern sailor of modern boats with an adapted junk rig. She sails surprisingly well, according to John Conway, a shipwright and colleague of Muir, although not as well as a gaff rigger of the same vintage, he says. Nonetheless, we could, if we wanted, give the last word on the sailing ability to Jack London. Fast as the fish patrol sloop Reindeer could sail, the junk outsailed her, and to avoid running her down, I hauled a little closer on the wind. But the junk likewise outpointed, and in a couple of minutes was abreast of the Reindeer and to windward.
Visit us at www.junkriggassociation.org, where you can find a lot of help or even join us for a nominal fee. Good sailing to you.